Winston Churchill saved Western civilization. That is the official version. The bulldog, the lion, the man who stood alone against Hitler when every other leader was ready to fold, the voice that held civilization together, the cigar, the V sign, the speeches that still send a chill down your spine 80 years later. That version is not wrong. But it leaves out one detail that changes everything. In 1938, the man who would save Western civilization was about to lose his house, not inconveniently short of cash. Not temporarily stretched, broken the way that ends careers and dissolves reputations. He had lost a fortune in the Wall Street crash of 1929. He had gambled heavily and lost. He had spent years maintaining a lifestyle, Chartwell, the staff, the champagne, the cigars, that his income could not remotely support. His debts had accumulated to the point where he was preparing to sell his beloved country home just to stay solvent. He was a political has-been. A backbencher nobody took seriously, a man whose warnings about Hitler were dismissed as the ranting of a washed-up warmonger desperate for relevance. And then something happened that never made it into the history books most people read. A group of extraordinarily wealthy men decided to save him. Not because they admired him, not out of patriotism, but because they needed him. They needed his voice, his platform, his name. And they were willing to pay for it. The checks were real. The names are documented. The files are sitting open at the Churchill Archive in Cambridge, available to anyone willing to look. What those files reveal is not a conspiracy theory. It is something more unsettling than that. It is a documented financial transaction that placed a nearly bankrupt politician into 10 Downing Street at the most consequential moment in the 20th century. And the question that nobody in the comfortable version of this history wants to answer is this. If the bankers funded Churchill, who exactly did they fund him for? And what did they expect in return? This is that story. In 1936, a private organization was established in London that history has almost entirely forgotten. It was called the Focus in Defense of Freedom and Peace. On the surface, it looked like a civic pressure group, concerned citizens from across the political spectrum. People alarmed by Hitler's rise and frustrated by Neville Chamberlain's policy of appeasement. It held dinners. It published pamphlets. It brought together politicians, journalists, academics, and business figures who shared a common view that Britain was sleepwalking toward catastrophe. Below the surface, it was something considerably more deliberate. The Focus was funded by a network of wealthy individuals with specific financial and political interests in the outcome of British foreign policy toward Germany. They were not Conservative Party grandees or landed aristocrats. They were drawn largely from the City of London's financial community, from Jewish business families with direct and urgent concerns about the direction of the Nazi government, and from Central European émigrés who had left Germany and Austria precisely because they understood what the regime intended. These were not naive idealists holding dinner parties. They were sophisticated operators who understood that political outcomes are shaped by political resources. And the political resource they needed most was a credible, prominent, articulate British voice that could move public opinion on Germany before it was too late. That voice existed. It was making the right arguments. It had the right platform and the right name recognition. It was also financially broken and politically isolated. Churchill was their solution. But backing Churchill was not simply a matter of endorsing his speeches. It required keeping him operationally viable. Research teams cost money. Correspondence networks cost money. Speaking engagements, travel, the maintenance of a political operation capable of competing for public attention, all of it cost money that Churchill personally did not have. The Focus provided the infrastructure. The dinners became briefing sessions. European politicians and intelligence figures were brought to London to give Churchill access to information his government was not sharing with him. His articles and speeches became sharper, better sourced, and more difficult to dismiss precisely because the network around him was feeding him material that backbench MPs did not normally access. Eugen Speer, an Austrian-born businessman who was one of the Focus's founding members, documented all of this in a memoir published in 1963. The book received almost no attention at the time. It received very little since. But Speer recorded the names, the meetings, the figures involved, and the explicit intention behind the operation. The intention was to keep Churchill financially and politically viable until the moment when British public opinion caught up with what he had been saying for years. That moment came. But before it did, something more direct was required. Because by 1938, the focus group's broader support was not enough. Churchill's personal finances had deteriorated to the point where the house itself was at risk. And a Churchill forced to sell Chartwell and retreat from public life to manage a financial crisis was a Churchill who could no longer serve the purpose the network had invested in. The situation required one man to step forward and make it personal. That man was Henry Strakosch. If you have found this channel through this video and this is the kind of financial history you have been looking for, please subscribe now. We cover exactly this, the documented transactions behind the official version of events. Every subscriber matters to what we are building here. Henry Strakosch was born in Austria in 1866. He had built a substantial fortune through mining finance in South Africa during the late 19th century, and then through a career in international banking and monetary economics that made him one of the most credible financial minds in the City of London. He had advised the Bank of England. He had sat on League of Nations financial committees. He had been consulted by governments across Europe on currency policy and monetary reform. He was not a speculator or a fringe figure. He was precisely the kind of man whose telephone calls get returned by central bank governors. He was also a man who understood, with the directness of someone who had grown up in Central Europe, what the Nazi government intended to do. He had watched the systematic exclusion of Jewish citizens from German economic life. He had tracked the capital flight from Germany as Jewish businesses were seized or forced into liquidation. He understood the ideology, not as political rhetoric, but as an operational program that was already being executed. And he had concluded that the British government's appeasement policy was not a negotiating strategy. It was a catastrophic miscalculation that would end in war anyway, on terms far worse than an earlier confrontation would have produced. He needed Churchill operational. And in 1938 he made a decision that changed the course of the 20th century. He paid Churchill's debts. The mechanism was specific. Strakosch took over Churchill's stock market liabilities, the positions that had been bleeding him financially since the Wall Street crash and the speculative activity of the years that followed. He absorbed the losses personally. He did not ask for repayment on any conventional schedule. He did not attach formal conditions. The value transferred in today's terms runs to several £100,000. Churchill wrote to his literary agent Brendan Bracken afterward that Strakosch had rendered him a service he would never forget. That letter exists in the Churchill archive. The financial correspondence documenting the transaction exists in the Churchill archive. The amounts are recorded, the dates are established. This is not speculation, it is documented, and it did not happen only once. When Churchill entered 10 Downing Street in May 1940, his personal finances were still fragile. Strakosch provided a further £5,000, channeled through Brendan Bracken, at the precise moment Churchill was assuming the most consequential office in British political life. When Strakosch died in 1943, he left Churchill £20,000 in his will. Churchill, who had started the 1930s nearly bankrupt and the war itself in poor financial condition, ended the conflict with what in today's money would represent several £1,000,000 in his accounts. The financial rescue had been completed across a decade. The investment had reached its logical conclusion. Now consider what that investment had purchased. The Czech connection adds another layer to this that the comfortable version of events consistently fails to examine. Documents that emerged in the decades following the Second World War established that the Czechoslovak government had been channeling funds toward British anti-appeasement political activity throughout the late 1930s. Czechoslovakia had the most direct and obvious financial interest in the outcome. It was the country the appeasement policy would eventually sacrifice at Munich. Its government understood that if Britain continued to accommodate German expansion, the result would be Czechoslovakia's dismemberment. It was prepared to invest in changing that outcome. The precise mechanism through which Czech government funds reached the British anti-appeasement network has not been fully established in the public record. But the circumstantial connection between Czech financial interests and the network operating around Churchill is substantial enough that serious historians have examined it and found it worth examining carefully. What is established is this. Churchill's political platform through the late 1930s was costing significantly more than Churchill personally could fund. The gap between his expenditure and his income was being filled by people with specific, documentable interests in the policy outcomes he was advocating. That is the financial architecture of how Britain's most consequential political figure was kept operational through the years when history needed him most. Now let us examine what that investment actually bought, and what happened at Munich when the platform the bankers had funded finally had its moment. September 1938. Neville Chamberlain flies to Munich. He returns to London waving a piece of paper and declaring peace in our time. Churchill is furious. His response is one of the most celebrated moments in his political career. He stands in the House of Commons and calls the Munich Agreement a total and unmitigated defeat. He tells a chamber full of politicians desperate to believe Chamberlain has secured something real, that they were given the choice between war and dishonor, that they chose dishonor, and that they would have war anyway. The chamber responds with hostility. Members shout him down. His own party is furious. His local conservative association in Epping comes close to deselecting him. The press that had supported appeasement treats him as a dangerous crank. He does not retract. He does not soften. He continues making the same case with the same uncompromising clarity. Across the City of London, the men who had been funding his platform watch the performance. Their investment is delivering exactly what they needed it to deliver. Because here is what the standard telling of the story almost always leaves out. Churchill's position on appeasement, his absolute refusal to accept that Hitler could be negotiated with, was not a lone act of personal conscience operating in a financial vacuum. It was a position that aligned precisely and completely with the interests of the people who had been keeping him solvent. Strakosch needed Churchill to oppose appeasement. The focus group needed Churchill to oppose appeasement. The Czech government desperately needed Churchill to oppose appeasement. Every transaction, every dinner, every research briefing, every cleared debt had been directed at keeping operational. The one prominent British politician making the case they required to be made. None of this means Churchill was wrong. This is the genuinely uncomfortable complexity at the center of this story, and it deserves to be stated directly. His warnings about Hitler were correct. Munich was the disaster he said it was. Appeasement failed in exactly the way he predicted. The war came anyway on terms far worse than an earlier confrontation might have produced. The men who funded him were not funding a war for its own sake. They were funding the political voice of someone who correctly understood the threat and whose assessment the British government was refusing to hear. But the fact that they were right does not resolve the question. What it means for a democracy when its most consequential political decisions are being shaped by private financial networks operating outside any public accountability is a question that Munich made urgent and that 70 years of comfortable mythology have allowed the British public to avoid answering. The appeasers were not simply cowards. Many of them were making a calculation that was wrong but not unreasonable given what they knew. They believed a war with Germany would be catastrophic for Britain, for the Empire, and for European civilization. They were not entirely wrong about the cost. The war that did come was catastrophic. Churchill knew this too. He chose to advocate confrontation anyway. He judged the alternative worse. He was right. And the men who had funded him made a correct investment. But who was in the room when the investment decision was made? And what did they understand about the return they were expecting? May 10th, 1940. Germany invades France, Belgium, Luxembourg, and the Netherlands simultaneously. Chamberlain resigns. The question of succession is not as simple as history presents it. The leading candidate within the Conservative Party was not Churchill. It was Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, steady, experienced, and politically orthodox. Halifax had more support within the parliamentary party than Churchill. He was Chamberlain's own preferred successor. He was the king's preference. Halifax withdrew his candidacy. His precise reasoning remains one of the genuine small mysteries of this period. He later offered various explanations, none entirely convincing, but he stepped aside, and Churchill became Prime Minister. The financial relationship between Churchill and his backers by this point had quietly continued. Strakosch provided the additional £5,000 at the moment Churchill entered Downing Street. The focus group network remained intact. The men who had invested in Churchill's platform now had their man in the most powerful office in Britain at the most critical moment in the country's history. Now consider what happened to Britain in the years that followed. The Second World War cost Britain approximately £25 billion at the time. By 1945, British national debt stood at 250% of gross domestic product. The country that entered the conflict as the center of a global empire left it as a debtor nation entirely dependent on American financial support. The Lend-Lease Agreement, the mechanism through which America supplied Britain with the weapons and materials to keep fighting, came with terms that were not remotely charitable. Britain paid for American support with military bases across the empire, with commercial concessions, with the systematic dismantling of the sterling trading bloc that had underpinned British economic power for 2 centuries. John Maynard Keynes negotiated the American loan terms in 1945. He described the experience as conducting a negotiation from a position of complete weakness. Britain needed the money. America knew Britain needed the money. The terms reflected that asymmetry with a precision that left no ambiguity about which country had emerged as the dominant financial power. The City of London's global financial preeminence, built over 2 centuries of imperial expansion, was traded away in exchange for the dollars Britain needed to keep fighting the war. Britain won the war, and in winning it, surrendered the financial architecture that had made it an empire. Churchill understood this was the likely outcome. He told his doctor during the darkest period of the conflict that he feared he would be the last prime minister of a great England. He knew American support meant American terms. He chose to pay that price. But the men who had funded his platform, what happened to their interests in the outcome? Here the picture is genuinely complicated. The Jewish communities of Central and Eastern Europe for whose protection the anti-appeasement cause had been partly fought were destroyed anyway. The Holocaust proceeded regardless of which government was in power in London. Czechoslovakia, whose government had reportedly invested in British anti-appeasement activity, emerged from the war as a Soviet satellite. The world Churchill's backers had been trying to preserve was gone. What remained was something different from what either Churchill or his supporters had been trying to protect. The story does not end in 1945, because the mechanism it reveals did not end in 1945. It became the template. It became the operating system. And once you see the structure clearly, you begin to see it everywhere. Step back from the specific names and look at the structure of what happened. A politician with the right instincts and the right message finds himself unable to operate at the level his convictions require. His personal financial position would force him into silence or compromise. A private network of wealthy individuals with specific policy preferences identifies him as the instrument they need. They provide financial support. They keep him operational. They fund the platform through the years when his own resources would have failed him. The politician advocates the positions his backers need advanced. The positions happen to be correct, but they are correct and funded simultaneously. And the distinction between genuine conviction and financial dependency is one the historical record cannot fully resolve. This is not unique to Churchill. It is not unique to the 1930s. What is unusual about the Churchill case is that the documentation exists and is open. The Strakosch transactions are recorded. The amounts are known. The dates are established. The Spear memoir is published. The Churchill archive is accessible. Historians have examined this material and confirmed what it shows. There is no inferential leap required. The primary sources say what they say. What they document is this. The great political decisions of the 20th century were shaped by men whose financial positions were directly managed by private networks whose interests were never publicly disclosed, whose influence was never publicly acknowledged, whose role in producing the outcomes they desired operated entirely outside democratic oversight. There was no register of interests, no public declaration, no moment where Churchill stood before his constituents and said, "I should disclose that my solvency has been secured by a City of London banker with strong views on British foreign policy." The financial relationship existed entirely outside the formal mechanisms of democratic accountability. Churchill was not instructed. The men who funded him did not need to tell him what to say. He already believed what they needed him to believe. The money did not create his convictions. It liberated them. It gave him the operational capacity to act on what he already believed when his own resources would have silenced him. That is a more troubling mechanism than simple corruption, because it requires no dishonesty from the politician, no explicit agreement, no quid pro quo that a court could examine. It requires only that wealthy individuals identify a politician whose existing beliefs align with their interests and then resource those beliefs more effectively than the politician could manage alone. The politician acts on principle. The funders achieve their policy objectives. And the public receives a political system in which the distribution of financial support invisibly determines whose principles get amplified and whose get marginalized. The politician whose convictions align with no substantial private interest struggles to maintain a platform. The politician whose convictions happen to align with people who can write significant checks finds those convictions mysteriously well-resourced at every critical moment. This did not end with Churchill. It did not end with the 1930s. Super PACs, dark money organizations, think tanks funded by industrial interests, media operations owned by individuals with specific policy preferences. All of them operating on the same logic that Strakosch and the focus group deployed in 1936. Identify the right voice. Keep it solvent. Let conviction do the rest. The Churchill story matters not because it proves a great man was corrupt. He was not corrupt in any simple sense. It matters because it reveals, with documentary precision, how the relationship between private money and public political power actually functions beneath the version of events we are taught. The checks were real. The policy outcomes were real. The connection between them was real. The version of Churchill in the textbooks, the lone voice of conscience, the man who stood against the tide on principle alone, is not entirely false, but it is incomplete in ways that change what the story actually means. Churchill knew who was keeping him solvent. He was not naive. He understood the transaction even if he never stated it plainly. He chose to accept the support, advocate the position, and allow history to record only the conviction. History has largely obliged, which raises one final question. Not about Churchill specifically. About every political figure you have watched deliver a speech that moved you. Every leader whose moral clarity seems so personal, so independent, so free of any interest but the public good. How many of them had a Strakosch? And how many of them would you still admire the same way if you knew? If this is the kind of documented financial history you have been looking for, the paper trail behind the official version, please subscribe to the channel. This is exactly what we cover, the gap between what gets taught and what the primary sources actually show. And if this video changed how you think about a story you thought you already knew, share it with someone who still believes the official version. Leave a # in the comments if you made it to the end. It seems appropriate. I will see you in the next one.